A 300-foot drop, a storm that could kill a man, and a tiny figure in a yellow jacket standing right on the edge of it all. For Park Ranger Tanner Coleman, this was supposed to be a routine patrol, a final sweep of the North Ridge before the storm of the century slammed into the Cascade Mountains. He'd spent 20 years in this wilderness. He knew its secrets. He knew its dangers. Or so he thought. He raised his binoculars, his knuckles white. It was a kid. Had to be. No more than 8 or 9 years old, wandering alone on Dead Man's Ridge, a place that earned its name 100 times over. The wind was picking up, screaming through the pines like a banshee. The sky had turned a bruised, ugly purple. Diane's voice on the radio was already a ghost, begging him to turn back. "The storm's been upgraded, Tanner. Get out of there." But Tanner couldn't. Not when he saw that little yellow jacket. Not when the image of his own son, Tyler, flashed in his mind. He keyed the mic, his voice tight. "Base, I've got a visual on a lost child. Dead Man's Ridge. I'm going in." "Negative, Tanner. Wait for backup." He switched the radio off. There was no time. The storm wasn't waiting, and neither was that cliff. He scrambled down from his lookout, rocks skittering under his boots, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He was 52 years old, but he moved like a man half his age, fueled by a grief he could never outrun, and a promise he'd made to his son's memory. He would save everyone he could. He didn't know he was running toward the biggest mistake of his career. He didn't know he was about to meet someone who would shatter his world. Someone who was nothing like she appeared. And he had no idea that the real danger wasn't the storm or the cliff. It was the secret hidden in the mountain itself. The rain started as a cold mist, then turned into icy needles driven by the wind. It plastered Tanner's hair to his forehead and turned the trail into a slick, muddy serpent. Every step was a risk, a slip here, a loose rock there, and he'd be the one needing a rescue. But his focus was locked on that tiny splash of yellow, a fragile beacon in the swirling gray fog. As he got closer, the figure stopped moving. It just sat down on a boulder, its back to him. Relief washed over him, cold and sharp. At least the kid wasn't teetering on the edge anymore. "Hey there!" he shouted, his voice snatched away by the wind. "Stay put! I'm coming to help!" No answer. The figure didn't even twitch. The last 100 yards were a brutal vertical climb. Tanner's lungs burned. His fingers were numb as he gripped exposed roots and jagged rock, hauling himself up the incline. He was running on pure adrenaline, a prayer echoing in the back of his mind. Please be okay. Please be okay. Finally, he crested the ridge. The yellow jacket was just 50 feet away. The fog swirled, creating a ghostly curtain between them. He could see a small person, hood up, sitting perfectly still. "Hey, buddy," Tanner called out, forcing his voice to be gentle, the way he would with a spooked animal. He approached slowly, hands visible. "I'm Tanner. I'm a park ranger. Are you hurt?" The figure turned. Tanner saw a pale face, partially hidden by the hood. Still nothing. No sound. No movement. "It's okay," he said, closing the distance. "I'm here to help you get back to safety. There's a big storm coming. We need to get you down from this ridge, right now." He was about 15 feet away when the figure stood up, and that's when the first alarm bell went off in Tanner's head. The movement wasn't right. It wasn't the clumsy, uncertain motion of a lost child. It was deliberate, mature. "I appreciate your concern," a woman's voice said, clear and crisp and undeniably adult. "But I don't need rescuing." Tanner stopped dead in his tracks. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The figure pushed back her hood, and his brain struggled to process what he was seeing. It was a woman's face, maybe in her mid-30s, with short dark hair and intelligent, weary eyes. A face marked by the distinct features of dwarfism. Tanner stammered, the hero narrative crumbling in his mind. "I'm sorry, from a distance. I thought that I was a lost child," she finished for him. She offered a small, tired smile. "It happens more often than you'd think." The wind howled, throwing a sheet of freezing rain across the ridge. A crash of thunder, deafeningly close, shook the very rock beneath their feet. The storm was here. "Well, lost child or not," Tanner said, shaking off his shock and finding his ranger voice again. This ridge isn't safe. That storm's going to hit any second, and when it does, this whole area will be impossible to navigate. The woman looked past him at the wall of black clouds charging toward them, and for the first time, a flicker of concern crossed her face. I didn't realize it was moving in so quickly. It got upgraded, Tanner explained. Look, we need to go. Now. I'm Ranger Tanner Coleman. Dr. Emily Mackenzie, she said, extending a small, firm hand. He shook it, the absurdity of the situation hitting him full force. He'd just risked his life in a monster storm to rescue a geologist. Dr. Mackenzie, he said, I'm sorry for the mistake, but I still need to get you off this ridge. It's called Dead Man's for a reason. As if on cue, a jagged fork of lightning split the sky, illuminating the canyon below. The thunder was instantaneous, a physical blow that vibrated through Tanner's bones. Point taken, Emily said, her voice tight. Lead the way, Ranger Coleman. As they scrambled away from the edge, Tanner's radio crackled to life. He'd forgotten he'd even turned it back on. It was Diane, her voice frantic. Coleman, do you copy? What's your status? Did you reach the child? Tanner winced, glancing at Emily, who raised a single questioning eyebrow. He brought the radio to his lips, feeling a flush of humiliation creep up his neck. Base, this is Coleman, he said, trying to sound professional. Situation is different than assessed. Subject is Dr. Emily Mackenzie, an adult hiker. We're both fine and heading back now. Over. There was a long pause. He could practically hear Diane trying to solve the bizarre puzzle he just handed her. Copy that, Coleman, she finally said, her voice dripping with confusion. Storm's picking up speed. Get back as quickly as you can. As he clipped the radio back to his belt, he couldn't quite meet Emily's gaze. Sorry about that, he muttered. Don't be, she said with a shrug that seemed too casual for the situation. Like I said, it happens, though usually not in the middle of a pending natural disaster. The rain was coming down in sheets now, a solid wall of water that reduced visibility to just a few feet. The trail was gone, replaced by a churning stream of mud and rock. The wind was a physical force, trying to rip them from the mountainside. So, Dr. Mackenzie, Tanner shouted over the roar of the storm, partly to distract from the sheer terror of their situation. What brings you to Dead Man's Ridge? Not exactly a tourist hotspot. Emily carefully stepped over a fallen log, her movements surprisingly sure-footed. I'm a geologist. I study fault lines. This ridge has formations that might indicate a previously undocumented fault. Tanner stared at her, a geologist, out here, alone, in this weather, chasing a theory. He couldn't decide if she was brilliant or insane. Watch out, he yelled, grabbing her arm and yanking her back just as a massive pine branch, as thick as his thigh, crashed down on the spot where she was about to step. It would have crushed her. Thanks, she gasped, her eyes wide as she stared at the splintered wood. This is getting too dangerous, Tanner screamed, his voice raw. There's a cave just off the trail, about 100 yards from here. It's our only shot. She just nodded, her face grim. They plunged off the trail into the thick underbrush, Tanner leading the way, literally pushing through the storm. He could feel the temperature dropping, the first signs of hypothermia licking at the edges of his consciousness. They were in a bad spot, a very, very bad spot. The cave was more of a rocky overhang, a shallow wound in the hillside, but it was dry and it was out of the wind. They scrambled inside, collapsing against the back wall, both of them soaked to the bone and shivering violently. Not exactly the Four Seasons, Emily said, her teeth chattering as she tried to wring water from her hair. Better than being out there, Tanner replied, shrugging off his heavy pack. He dug through it, his numb fingers fumbling with the clips. He pulled out a silver Mylar emergency blanket and handed it to her. Here, try to get warm. She took it with a grateful nod, wrapping it around her small shoulders. He kept digging. He had beef jerky, 2 energy bars, and he smiled, pulling out his thermos like a trophy. About half a thermos of coffee. Might still be warm. Ranger Coleman, Emily said, a genuine grin spreading across her pale face. You just moved up to 4 stars in my book. They huddled together against the cold stone, sharing the coffee from the thermos cap, the storm raging just feet away. The world outside was a symphony of chaos, cracking trees, roaring wind, and the percussive drumming of the rain. Inside their tiny sanctuary, there was only the sound of their own ragged breathing and the chattering of their teeth. So, Tanner said, trying to keep their minds off the cold, Western State University? That's in Millfield, right? Emily nodded, pulling the blanket tighter. Been there 6 years, tenure track, though that's looking less certain after my department chair shot down my research proposal. The one about the fault line. Yeah, she said, and even in the dim light, Tanner could see a fire ignite in her eyes. Professor Lawrence thinks I'm chasing ghosts. There's no evidence of seismic activity in this region, Dr. Mackenzie, she mimicked in a pompous, booming voice. Perhaps your time would be better spent on more established research areas. And you disagree. Disagree? Her eyes flashed. The geological formations on this ridge make zero sense without tectonic activity. The layers are all wrong. There are historical accounts from the local tribes describing what could only be an earthquake right in this area about 300 years ago. An earthquake nobody in the scientific community knows about. I've never heard of any earthquakes around here, Tanner admitted. Exactly, she said, leaning forward, her shivering forgotten. That's what makes it so groundbreaking. If I can prove there's an undocumented fault line here, it could change how we understand the seismic risk for this entire region. It could save lives. Tanner was captivated by her passion, but he couldn't shake the image of her on that ridge. So you came out here alone to gather evidence with a major storm in the forecast? She had the grace to look a little sheepish. I might have underestimated the weather. Suddenly, a sound unlike the storm cut through the air. A deep, grinding groan that seemed to come from the mountain itself. The ground beneath them trembled. Not a violent shake, but a low, powerful vibration. Dust and small pebbles rained down from the cave's ceiling. They froze, staring at each other in the gloom. What was that? Tanner whispered. Emily's eyes were wide, but not with fear, with something else. Something that looked terrifyingly like excitement. That, she breathed, a slow smile spreading across her face. That was the mountain talking to us. He had come to rescue a child from the storm. Now he was trapped in a cave with a woman who seemed to be hunting the storm's bigger, angrier brother. And he was starting to think she was far more dangerous. The trembling stopped as quickly as it started. Silence descended, thick and heavy, broken only by the howl of the wind. Tanner's heart was pounding. He was a man of the wilderness, comfortable with its predictable dangers. Wind, rain, snow, animals. But the ground itself moving? That was something else entirely. That was ancient, unstoppable power. You're not scared, he said. It wasn't a question. Emily was on her feet, peering out of the cave entrance into the gray, swirling chaos. Scared? Tanner, this is what I've been looking for. A microtremor, probably triggered by the rain saturating the soil. This is evidence. This is proof. She was practically vibrating with intellectual fervor. He, on the other hand, was calculating their odds of being buried alive. It's also a sign that this whole area is unstable, he said, his voice grim. We need to stay put until this passes. She turned to him, her face alight. You don't get it. This isn't just a storm. It's a geological event. We're sitting in the middle of a natural laboratory. We're sitting in the middle of a death trap, he countered. He was starting to feel a strange mix of admiration and profound concern for this woman. Her brilliance was matched only by her apparent lack of a self-preservation instinct. To distract them both, he steered the conversation back to safer ground. What made you become a park ranger? She asked suddenly, her scientific curiosity shifting from the mountain to him. You don't seem like someone who just fell into it. The question caught him off guard. He looked out at the storm, but he was seeing a different day, a different kind of darkness. I was a lawyer, he said, his voice flat. Environmental law, corner office in Seattle, expensive suits, the whole 9 yards. What changed? He didn't have to think. The answer was always there, right beneath the surface. My son, Tyler, he died in a car accident. He was 17. He said the words matter-of-factly, the way a person describes a scar they've had for a long time. The pain was still there, but it had become a part of him. After that, the legal briefs, the case files, it was all just paper. It didn't mean anything. Tyler and I, we used to come hiking out here every summer. These mountains. This was our place. It was the only place I still felt like I could connect with him. Emily's expression softened, the scientific fire in her eyes replaced by a gentle empathy. I'm so sorry, Tanner. He just nodded. My wife, ex-wife now, she couldn't stand it. She wanted to move away, start over. I couldn't leave. So I quit my job, got certified as a ranger, and here I am. 7 years later, still talking to my son on these trails. Do you regret it? Leaving that life behind? Not for a second, he said, and he meant it. Out here, what I do feels real. It matters. She nodded thoughtfully. I understand that. It's why I became a geologist. My parents are both doctors. They wanted me to specialize in dwarfism research. They thought I'd have a personal stake in it. And you didn't want to study something bigger than yourself? He guessed, starting to understand her. Exactly, she said with a small smile. Something that would be here long after I'm gone, like mountains and fault lines. The rain began to lessen, the roar of the storm quieting to a steady, rhythmic drumming. The thunder was a distant grumble now. He checked his watch. They'd been in the cave for nearly 2 hours. I think we can risk heading back, he said, standing up and stretching his stiff, cold muscles. The ranger station is still about 3 miles from here. Think you're up for it, Dr. Mackenzie. She folded the emergency blanket with neat, precise movements and handed it back to him. Lead the way, Ranger Coleman, and after sharing coffee and life stories while hiding from a storm, I think you can call me Emily. Only if you call me Tanner, he replied, a hint of a smile touching his own lips. They stepped out of the cave into a world transformed. The forest was battered and broken. The air smelled of wet earth and shattered pine. As they picked their way back toward what was left of the trail, the ground was soft and treacherous underfoot. So, Tanner said, breaking the silence, about this fault line theory of yours. The tremor we felt, does that happen often? Emily's face lit up again. No, that's what's so incredible. It suggests the fault isn't extinct, just dormant, capable of being reactivated under the right conditions, like intense seismic pressure or, say, a massive amount of rainfall putting stress on the tectonic plates. Her words sent a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the cold. The new vacation homes being built just outside the park's eastern boundary, the small towns nestled in the valleys below, all sitting on land everyone thought was stable. If you're right, he started. It means people need to know, she finished, her voice filled with a fierce urgency. They walked the rest of the way in a strange bubble of shared purpose. By the time the ranger station came into view, mud-splattered and exhausted, they weren't a ranger and a rescued hiker anymore. They were two people who had stumbled upon a secret the mountain had been keeping for centuries. Diane was waiting on the steps, her face a mask of worry that quickly morphed into utter bewilderment as she took in the sight of Tanner walking alongside a small, determined-looking woman instead of a lost child. Well, she said, her arms crossed, this isn't quite what I expected. Diane, this is Dr. Emily Mackenzie, Tanner said, the understatement of the year. She's a geologist, and I think she just found an earthquake. Diane's office was small, cluttered, and smelled of strong coffee and ozone from the humming electronics. She listened, her expression shifting from disbelief to grudging curiosity, as Emily, fueled by 2 cups of coffee and sheer adrenaline, laid out her theory. She sketched maps on a notepad, spoke of rock striations and tectonic stress, and described the tremor they'd felt in the cave. An undocumented fault line, Diane said, leaning back in her chair and staring at the topographical map on her wall as if seeing it for the first time. Right through the eastern quadrant. That's a lot to take in. I know it sounds outlandish, Emily said, but the evidence is there. I just need more of it. I need to get back out there, take samples, get readings. Tanner saw the look in Diane's eye. She was a by-the-book supervisor, a lone geologist making extraordinary claims based on a tremor felt during a record-breaking storm wasn't exactly standard procedure. My department at the university won't fund it, Emily added, anticipating the question. My chair, Professor Lawrence, he thinks I'm imaginative. That was all it took. Tanner had spent his life fighting for underdogs, first in the courtroom, now in the wilderness. She needs a guide, he said, looking straight at Diane. Someone who knows the terrain. I'll take her. Diane's eyebrows shot up. You? Tanner, you're a ranger, not a research assistant, and your job is to keep people off dangerous ridges, not lead them back onto them. This is a safety issue, Diane, he argued. If she's right, we need to know. The new housing development at Eagles Point, the town of Cedar Creek, they're all sitting right on top of her proposed fault line. We have a responsibility to investigate. He'd framed it in terms she couldn't ignore. Public safety, responsibility. It was a checkmate. Diane sighed, running a hand through her short graying hair. Fine. One day. You can take her out for one day. Officially, it's a preliminary geological survey to assess storm-related instability. Keep it clean. And Tanner, be careful. The following weekend, the sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. The air was crisp and clean, washed new by the storm. Emily was waiting for him at the trailhead, punctual to the minute, wearing another bright yellow jacket. It was becoming her signature. Ready to go earthquake hunting? He asked. I've been looking forward to this all week, she admitted, a genuine smile lighting up her face. I went over the photos I took last time. I'm more convinced than ever. He had planned a route to Eagle's Cleft, a dramatic cliff face with similar rock composition to Deadman's Ridge, but with more stable footing. As they hiked, he found himself falling into an easy rhythm with her. He'd unconsciously started to adjust his long-legged stride, but he quickly realized he didn't need to. Emily moved with a practiced, efficient grace, her shorter legs no impediment on the steep trail. She was, in her own way, a force of nature. You mentioned you've been hiking since you were 12, he said as they paused for water. My parents were determined, she said, choosing her word carefully. Determined I wouldn't be limited by my dwarfism. They signed me up for everything. Swimming, gymnastics, rock climbing. Hiking was the one that stuck. I think they were terrified I'd use my condition as an excuse to avoid challenges. Did you? He asked. She shot him a sideways glance, a mischievous glint in her eye. Only when I didn't want to do the dishes. By midday, they reached Eagle's Cleft. The cliff face was split open, revealing layers of rock strata like the pages of an ancient book. Emily stood before it, her expression one of pure reverence. This is it, she breathed, pulling a camera and a set of specialized tools from her pack. This is perfect. For the next hour, Tanner watched, fascinated as she worked. She was completely in her element, moving with a purpose and confidence that was captivating. She pointed out things he'd never noticed in 20 years of hiking these trails. Faint parallel lines etched into the stone, subtle shifts in the layers, mineral deposits that told a story of immense pressure and movement. See these, she called out, her voice filled with excitement. She was kneeling beside a section of exposed bedrock. These are slickened sides, polished surfaces created when two rock masses slide past each other during a fault movement. This is it, Tanner. This is the smoking gun. He crouched beside her, genuinely impressed. So your theory, it's real. It's more than real, she said, beaming up at him. With this and the samples from Deadman's Ridge, I might finally have enough to convince Professor Lawrence to fund a proper expedition. As they packed up to leave, Emily paused, looking at the topographical map. Her finger traced a line from Deadman's Ridge to Eagle's Cleft. Then she kept going, her brow furrowed in concentration. The line continued northeast, across valleys and peaks. Tanner watched her, a knot of unease tightening in his stomach as he saw where her finger was heading. It stopped on a small, unnamed blue circle on the map, a place not on any official trails, a place he knew better than any other on Earth. What is it? He asked, his voice tighter than he intended. The patterns, she murmured almost to herself, the stress fractures, the direction of the striations. It's all pointing in the same direction. The fault doesn't stop here. She looked up at him, her scientific curiosity overriding everything else. Based on this trajectory, the line of maximum geological stress would run directly through here. She tapped the small, unnamed blue circle. Tyler's lake, his sanctuary, the place he went to talk to his son, the one patch of earth he considered sacred. And she was telling him it was sitting on a seismic time bomb. The world seemed to shrink down to that single point on the map. Tyler's lake. He could picture it perfectly. The crystal clear water, the ancient pines ringing the shore, the flat rock where he and Tyler would skip stones for hours. It was a place of profound peace, of memory, of a pain so deep it had become a part of the landscape. And now this woman he'd known for less than a week was telling him it was a place of hidden violence, a place of danger. "There's nothing there," he said, his voice cold and hard. "It's just a lake." Emily looked up from the map, sensing the sudden wall he had thrown up between them. Geologically speaking, it's the most logical continuation of the fault line. The basin the lake sits in could even be a direct result of tectonic subsidence. She was speaking a different language, a language of science and logic that felt like a violation of his sacred ground. "I know that lake better than anyone," he said, his voice low. "I've been going there for 15 years. There's no fault line." "You wouldn't necessarily see it on the surface," she persisted, not understanding the true source of his resistance. "The evidence would be in the bedrock, in the surrounding formations." He couldn't explain it to her. He couldn't tell her that what she was proposing felt like a desecration. It was like she was trying to dissect a memory, to analyze a ghost. The easy camaraderie of the day evaporated, replaced by a tense, uncomfortable silence. They hiked back to the trailhead without speaking, the unspoken argument hanging in the air between them. When they reached their vehicles, Emily turned to him, her expression hesitant. "Look, Tanner, I'm sorry if I—" "Forget it," he cut her off. "It's been a long day." "Next weekend," she said, trying to salvage things. "There are a few more sites I'd like to check out, if you're willing to be my guide again." He hesitated. A part of him, the logical part, the ranger part, knew she was right to pursue this. But the grieving father in him wanted to tell her to stay away from his lake, away from his memories. "Tanner?" "Next Saturday," he heard himself say, the words feeling like a betrayal. "It's the anniversary of Tyler's death. I spend it alone, up at the lake." "Oh," she said, her face softening with immediate understanding. "Of course. I'm so sorry. I completely understand." They stood there in the long afternoon shadows, the chasm between them wider than ever. He should have left it there. He should have said goodbye and driven away. But then he looked at her, at the fierce intelligence in her eyes, at the unapologetic passion for her work, and he thought of Tyler. His son had been fascinated by science, curious about everything. He would have been peppering Emily with 1,000 questions. He would have loved this. "I've never taken anyone else up there," he said, the words coming out before he could stop them. "Not my ex-wife, not my colleagues. It's my place." She just nodded, respecting the weight of his confession. He took a deep breath, feeling like he was standing on the edge of a cliff all over again. "But if you're interested, I'd like to show it to you. Not as a geologist, just as a place." Her response was quiet, but her eyes held a universe of understanding. "I would be honored, Tanner. Truly." The drive back to his cabin was a blur. He felt raw, exposed. He had just invited a near stranger into the most private, painful corner of his heart. As he watched her small SUV pull away, he felt a terrifying mix of dread and something else. Something he hadn't felt in a very, very long time. Hope. The week leading up to the anniversary was agonizing. Tanner was on edge, distracted. Diane had to radio him twice for missed check-ins. "You okay, Tanner?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. "You're not yourself." He mumbled something about the anniversary and left it at that. How could he explain that he was about to willingly merge the two most significant parts of his life? The all-consuming grief for his son and the disorienting, compelling presence of Emily Mackenzie? The night before, he found himself cleaning his cabin for a visitor for the first time in years. He swept the porch, dusted the bookshelves, even changed the sheets on the spare bed. A thought that made him pause. Was he presuming too much? The idea of Emily staying over sent a jolt through him that was equal parts anxiety and excitement. Saturday dawned cool and clear. He was up before the sun, packing a lunch, his hands moving on autopilot. Alongside the sandwiches and water, he packed the small, smooth stone urn that sat on his mantelpiece. Every year he scattered a small portion of Tyler's ashes on the lake. He hadn't told Emily about this ritual. He wasn't sure he could go through with it while she was there. At precisely 9 o'clock, her SUV crunched up the gravel driveway. She stepped out with a bright smile, her yellow jacket tied around her waist. She looked right, standing there in the morning light, framed by the mountains. "Morning," she called out. "Your directions were perfect." "Coffee?" he asked, his voice a little rough. Inside, she looked around the cabin, her curious eyes taking everything in. "Nice place," she said, "very you. What makes it very me?" She took a sip of the coffee he handed her. Practical, but not cold. Comfortable without being fussy. And, she added, nodding toward his bookshelves, full of unexpected depth. He felt an unfamiliar warmth spread through his chest. The hike to the lake was a challenge. The trail had washed out years ago, and now it was a network of barely there game trails and steep scrambles over boulder fields. He watched her carefully, ready to offer a hand. But she never needed it. She moved over the difficult terrain with the same sure-footed confidence he'd seen on Dead Man's Ridge. At one point she stopped, running her hand along an exposed rock face. "Interesting stratification," she murmured, the geologist in her momentarily taking over. "Looks like there was significant uplift at some point." "More evidence for your fault line?" he asked, surprised that he didn't feel the same defensiveness as before. "Possibly," she said, then seemed to catch herself. "Sorry, no geology today, I promise." "It's okay," he found himself saying. "It's part of the story of this place, I guess." After 2 hours of hard climbing, they reached the final ridge. Below them, nestled in a perfect bowl of granite and pine, lay the lake. It was just as he always pictured it, a flawless mirror reflecting the impossible blue of the sky. "Oh, Tanner," Emily breathed, her voice filled with a reverence that matched his own. "It's perfect." He led her down to the shore, to the flat rock that was his spot. They sat in silence for a long time, the only sounds the gentle lapping of the water and the distant cry of a hawk. Finally, he reached into his pack and took out the small stone urn. "Tyler loved this place," he said, his voice low. "We found it by accident when he was 14. Got lost in a fog and stumbled down that same ridge we just climbed." He told her how they came back every summer, how it became their tradition. He told her about the ashes. "It felt too final, scattering them all at once," he explained, turning the urn in his hands. "So each year on this day, I bring a small part of him back here." Her expression was full of a gentle, profound empathy. "Would you like me to give you some privacy?" she asked softly. He considered it. For 7 years, this ritual had been his alone, a solitary act of remembrance. But looking at her now, sitting beside him in this sacred place, being alone was the last thing he wanted. "Stay," he said, the word a quiet plea. "If you don't mind." "I don't mind." He walked to the water's edge and knelt, just as he had done 7 times before. He opened the urn and gently tipped a small amount of the gray ash onto the surface of the lake. It swirled for a moment, a tiny galaxy of memory before dissolving into the clear water. "Hey, kiddo," he whispered, so quietly she couldn't possibly hear. "I brought someone to meet you today. I think you'd approve." He stayed there for a long moment, his eyes closed, feeling the sun on his face. When he returned to the rock, Emily's small hand found his, her fingers lacing through his own. It wasn't a gesture of pity, but of simple, solid comfort, of presence. "Thank you," he said, his throat tight, "for being here." "Thank you," she replied, "for sharing this with me." They sat like that, hands linked, as the sun climbed higher in the sky. The heavy weight of the day, a weight he had carried alone for so long, felt lighter, shared. Finally, he let go of her hand and reached for his pack. "Hungry?" He unpacked the lunch he'd made, and as a surprise, 2 carefully wrapped slices of homemade apple pie. "You made pie?" Emily's eyes widened in genuine astonishment. Don't sound so surprised, he said with mock indignation. I have skills beyond misidentifying geologists. She laughed, a clear, happy sound that echoed across the water, a sound of life in a place that had been dedicated to death. After they ate, she found a flat, smooth stone, and with a flick of her wrist, sent it skipping across the lake's surface. 4 perfect bounces. Not bad, he commented. Tyler's record? She asked, already knowing the answer. 11, he said with a proud grin. He had a knack for finding the perfect stones. For the next hour, they skipped stones. They laughed. They were 2 people enjoying a beautiful day by a lake. And then it hit him. He was having fun. On this day, the realization brought a sharp, unexpected pang of guilt. What is it? Emily asked, immediately sensing his shift in mood. I just realized I'm having fun, he said honestly. It feels wrong, on today of all days. She looked at him, her expression serious but kind. Do you think Tyler would want this day to be only about sadness? From what you've told me, he sounded like a happy kid, someone who liked to laugh. The question hit him like a physical blow. He thought of his son, of his goofy grin and his terrible jokes. He'd probably be rolling his eyes at me for being so somber all these years, he admitted. Then I think he'd approve, Emily said softly, handing him a perfectly flat stone. He took it and sent it flying. It danced across the water. 8 perfect skips, his best of the day. A weight he didn't even know he was carrying lifted from his shoulders. As the afternoon shadows began to lengthen, they packed up to leave. In previous years, leaving the lake was the hardest part. It felt like saying goodbye to his son all over again. But today, it felt different. It felt like turning a page, not closing a book. The hike back was quiet, but it was a comfortable silence now, filled with a new, unspoken understanding. When they reached his cabin, the sun was setting, painting the mountains in fiery strokes of orange and purple. Would you like to come in? He offered, not wanting the day to end. Coffee? She hesitated, glancing at her watch. I should probably start back. It's a long drive to Millfield. He tried to hide his disappointment. Of course. What are your plans for Thanksgiving? She asked suddenly. The question came out of nowhere. Thanksgiving? I usually work. Let the rangers with families have the day off. Would you consider a change in tradition? She asked, her gaze direct. I host a small gathering for friends and colleagues who don't have family nearby. It's nothing fancy, but I'd like it if you were there. An invitation into her life, beyond the mountains. It was more than he could have hoped for. I'd like that, he said, his voice thick with emotion. As she turned to leave, an impulse, strong and undeniable, seized him. Emily, she looked back. There's a meteor shower next weekend, he said, his heart hammering. The view from up here is supposed to be spectacular, if you're interested. Another scientific expedition? She asked, a teasing smile playing on her lips. He shook his head, finding the courage to say what he really meant. No, just a date, if you want it to be. The word hung in the air between them, shimmering with possibility. Her smile widened, reaching her eyes. I'd like that very much, Tanner. He stood on his porch and watched her headlights disappear down the dark forest road. The anniversary of his greatest loss had somehow, miraculously, also become the day he started to live again. He looked up at the first stars pricking the twilight sky. Thanks, kiddo, he whispered. And for the first time, he felt like his son was smiling back. The meteor shower was the first of many dates. Autumn weekends became their sacred time. Emily would drive up from Millfield on Friday nights, her small SUV loaded with textbooks and geological samples, and the cabin would transform from a solitary refuge into a home. They fell into a rhythm that felt as natural as the changing seasons. One Sunday evening, as they sat on the porch swing, Emily leaned her head on his shoulder. Professor Lawrence still isn't convinced about the fault line, she said, her voice laced with frustration. He's calling the evidence circumstantial. I'm going to apply for an external research grant, but without my department's support, the odds aren't good. So we convince him, Tanner said simply. The following Friday, Emily arrived late, her face pale and drawn. What happened? He asked, his gut clenching. Lawrence happened, she said. her voice trembling with a rage she was trying to contain. He rejected my preliminary findings. In front of the entire department. He said, he said my conclusions were colored by an overly imaginative perspective, perhaps due to a limited physical scope. Tanner saw red. He used your height against you. He basically called me a fantasist who can't see the big picture because I'm short, she said, finally letting the tears fall. 7 years I've worked to prove myself, and he still dismisses me like a child. That's it, Tanner said, his voice a low growl. We're not letting him get away with this. That night, fueled by righteous anger and 2 glasses of whiskey, they hatched a plan. It was audacious. It was deceptive. It was brilliant. Tanner called Diane the next morning. I need a favor, he said. A big one. A week later, a formal-looking email sent from an official Evergreen Ridge National Park account landed in Professor Lawrence's inbox. It was an invitation. The Park Service, it said, had become aware of potentially significant geological instability along its eastern boundary and formally requested the expertise of the Western State University Geology Department for a preliminary site visit. The survey would be led by the park's most experienced wilderness guide, Ranger Tanner Coleman. Dr. Emily McKenzie, who had first brought the anomalies to the park's attention, would be assisting. He can't say no, Emily said, her eyes gleaming as they read Lawrence's enthusiastic reply over the phone. It's an official request from a government agency. It feeds his ego. He has no idea he's walking into a trap, Tanner said with a grim smile. The day of the site visit, Tanner wore his most impeccably pressed uniform. He was the very picture of calm authority. Lawrence and 3 other committee members arrived in a pristine black SUV, dressed in brand new, top-of-the-line hiking gear. Professor Lawrence, Tanner said, shaking the tall, thin man's hand. Welcome to Evergreen Ridge. We appreciate you lending us your expertise. The pleasure is ours, Ranger Coleman, Lawrence boomed. He glanced at Emily, who was standing quietly to the side, with an air of surprise. And I understand we have Dr. McKenzie to thank for facilitating this collaboration. I simply mentioned the unusual formations to Ranger Coleman, Emily said, playing her part perfectly. He recognized their potential significance immediately. Tanner had to suppress a grin. He led them on a grueling tour. He chose the most challenging yet safest routes to the evidence sites. Within an hour, the academics, unused to the rugged terrain, were sweating and breathing heavily, all except Emily, who navigated the steep inclines with an ease that was impossible to ignore. He took them to Eagle's Cleft. The evidence was irrefutable, even to a skeptic. The slickened sides, the displaced strata. The mountain was screaming its secret. This is remarkable, Lawrence admitted, all condescension gone from his voice as he stared at the rock face. He turned to Emily, a newfound respect in his eyes. And you navigated this terrain on your own? The geology doesn't always make itself accessible, Professor, she replied coolly. This was the moment Tanner had been waiting for. It's a good thing we're getting this data now, he said, his tone casual, especially with that new luxury condo development going in just outside the park boundary. They just broke ground last month. He saw a flicker of something in Lawrence's eyes. Panic. Of course, Tanner continued, all their geological surveys will have to be redone in light of this new fault data. Public safety, you understand. I believe the consulting firm that signed off on the initial plans was Geotech Solutions? Silence. One of the committee members coughed awkwardly. Geotech Solutions was a firm Lawrence frequently consulted for, a lucrative side gig he rarely disclosed to the university. He had signed off on the safety of a multi-million-dollar development sitting right on top of a fault line he'd refused to believe existed. He was trapped, caught between irrefutable science and his own dirty secret. His career was hanging by a thread, and a 4-2 geologist and a grieving park ranger were the ones holding the scissors. Lawrence's face was pale. Well, he said, his voice strained, I believe I speak for the entire committee when I say that Western State would be proud to partner with the park on this groundbreaking research. He turned to Emily. And Dr. McKenzie, it appears I owe you an apology for underestimating both your theory and your capabilities. As the defeated academics trudged back to the ranger station, Emily walked beside Tanner. a triumphant, irrepressible smile on her face. As soon as the SUV was out of sight, she let out a whoop of pure joy and threw her arms around his neck. "We did it!" she yelled, her face radiant. "You did it!" he said, lifting her in a celebratory spin. "You make a good team," she said, her hands still on his shoulders as he set her down. "The distinguished ranger and the determined geologist." "Sounds like a boring adventure novel," he joked. "Or a very interesting love story," she replied softly, and rose on her tiptoes to kiss him. That night, after a celebratory dinner, they sat on his porch swing. "The grant is a sure thing now," she said, her head nestled against his side. "It'll mean 6 months of field work. I'll need to be based up here." Tanner's heart skipped a beat. He thought about the cabin, about how empty it felt when she wasn't there. He took a deep breath. "What if you based yourself here, permanently?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. She lifted her head, her eyes searching his. "Tanner Coleman, are you asking me to move in with you?" "I am," he said, his heart in his throat. "I know it's fast, but these past few months, when you're here, this place finally feels like home." She was silent for a long moment, and he braced himself for rejection. "My lease is up in December," she said finally, a slow smile spreading across her face. "But you should know, I come with a lot of books and rock samples." "I wouldn't have it any other way," he said, pulling her close. Winter descended on the Cascades, blanketing the mountains in a deep, silent white. Inside the cabin, a new life was taking root. Tanner lowered kitchen cabinets and installed custom step systems. Emily filled his bookshelves with her geological texts, her presence softening the cabin's rustic edges. The grant came through just before Christmas. Full funding. It was the ultimate vindication. The spring survey was a whirlwind of activity. Emily hired 2 research assistants, and Tanner helped her convert an old storage shed into a state-of-the-art field lab. Their home became the official base camp for the Evergreen Fault Project. The days were long and filled with hard work, but their evenings were spent on the porch, sharing meals and watching the sunset. A small, unlikely family forged by a shared purpose. By summer, the findings were undeniable. The Evergreen Fault was real, and it was a risk that regional planners had to take seriously. Emily was invited to present her findings at a major symposium at the university. "Are you nervous?" Tanner asked the morning of the presentation. "Terrified," she admitted. But when she walked onto that stage, she was transformed. She was a giant. She held the entire auditorium of academics, engineers, and government officials captive with her brilliance, her passion, and her irrefutable data. The applause was thunderous. She had done it. She had forced them all to see past her stature and recognize the magnitude of her intellect. That evening, Tanner told her he had a celebratory surprise. He drove them back into the mountains, and as the sun began to set, they started up the familiar trail to Tyler's Lake. When they reached the ridge overlooking the water, now turned to liquid gold by the setting sun, he turned to her. "Emily Mackenzie," he began, his voice thick with emotion as he knelt on one knee. "You walked into my life in the most unexpected way imaginable. You taught me that the greatest discoveries require seeing beyond the surface. I can't imagine this life without you. Will you marry me?" He opened a small wooden box. Inside was a simple silver ring, inlaid with shimmering blue-green pieces of labradorite, the same type of stone as the pendant he'd given her months before, a stone he had found himself on the shore of this very lake. Tears streamed down her face as she nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Tanner. Yes." 3 months later, on a crisp October afternoon, they were married on the shore of Tyler's Lake. A small group of their closest friends, Diane, Professor Lawrence, their research assistants, stood as witnesses. Emily wore a simple blue dress and sturdy hiking boots. Tanner wore his formal ranger uniform. Their vows spoke of fault lines and unexpected discoveries, of finding home in the wilderness and in each other. Later, as their friends celebrated with a champagne picnic, they stood on their flat rock, looking out over the water. "I still can't believe this all started because you thought I was a lost child," she said, a mischievous smile playing on her lips. "I maintain it was a reasonable error," he chuckled, pulling her close. "You have to admit, you were a long way from home." "No," she said, her expression softening as she rested her head against his chest. "I wasn't. I just hadn't found it yet. The mountains stood silent witness around them, their ancient secrets now part of a new story. A story of how two people, broken in their own ways, found each other on a foggy ridge and discovered that the most beautiful landscapes and the most profound love often emerge from the places where the world has been fractured and remade. If you enjoyed this story of love and discovery against all odds, do me a favor and hit that like button. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications because you won't want to miss the incredible stories we have coming up next.